I think a lot of it comes to actually having knowledge and access to what pediatric feeding disorder is. Because so many times we've had families come to us and say, we've been trying feeding therapy, but it hasn't been working and we need to find another therapist. And we do have a provider directory on our website that has many different therapists. And I think the ones on there at least understand PFD. But when something isn't working, you got to kind of go back to square one and look at it from the framework perspective of, okay, do we really know where maybe pain is coming from and why we might be trying to avoid meal times?
Everyone, welcome to the Nourishing Autism Podcast. Today we are diving into an important but overlooked topic, pediatric feeding disorder, or PFD, and its impact on children, including those on the autism spectrum. I'm really excited to dig into what PFD actually is and how this actually may be affecting your child if they have a limited diet. Joining me is Jaclyn Pederson, the CEO of Feeding Matters, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting children with PFD and their families. Let me just tell you, Feeding Matters is an incredible organization. They have incredible trainings for practitioners around pediatric feeding disorder, and I've known about them for 5 or 6 years and just have known that they are the leading organization to help with raising awareness around pediatric feeding disorder. Jaclyn has been at the forefront of reshaping the system of care for pediatric feeding challenges, and under her leadership, Feeding Matters has become a driving force for awareness, education, and advocacy. We'll be talking about what PFD actually is, how it affects children's growth and development, and what early intervention is so critical, especially in children on the autism spectrum who face a higher prevalence of feeding issues. Did you know that up to 80% of children on the autism spectrum may experience some form of feeding challenge? So PFD goes beyond picky eating and can include difficulty swallowing, avoiding certain textures, and even needing a feeding tube. So today, Jaclyn's going to help us understand what families can do and what resources are available to ensure these children thrive. Let's get started. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Nourishing Autism Podcast. I am super psyched to be sitting here today with Jaclyn Pederson. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm excited for our conversation. She's the CEO of Feeding Matters, and I'm really excited to talk about their organization because I've known about them for a very long time. So welcome to the podcast, Jaclyn.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course. Yeah. And we've already had, I feel like, a good conversation before this even started airing.
No.
So I'm like excited to dig in deeper. But tell us more about who you are and what Feeding Matters is.
Yeah. So my name is Jaclyn Pederson. I'm CEO of Feeding Matters. I have been with Feeding Matters for 11 years, and I started with this organization just as our grant coordinator and volunteer coordinator. And I was really interested in what we did. My background is in nonprofit management and healthcare innovation and systems practice. So it was a nice marrying of the nonprofit work of making a difference with also changing kind of the healthcare landscape and some of the healthcare challenges that we see in this world. But what I didn't have at the time was any real life experience around feeding or even having children or anything like that. And so I quickly fell in love with our mission and just continued to see the growth of our organization. And I took over as CEO during the pandemic when we really needed to make sure we stayed together as a team and put our values at the center of our organization to be able to kind of make it through that time. And it was amazing because at that same time was when the PFD, pediatric feeding disorder diagnosis became official after years of us advocating to the CDC. And so it was just a wonderful chance of our kind of the next generation of our organization. And just a little bit about Feeding Matters itself. We are a national nonprofit organization headquartered in Arizona. We support families of children who have pediatric feeding disorder, and oftentimes it can look like many different things, but pediatric feeding disorder is when a child really isn't eating appropriate for their age. And so sometimes that may be you have a 4-year-old who you're expecting to have some table food and stuff, but they're really sustaining themselves on a nutritional drink. Or it may even be so severe that they need a feeding tube for their nutrition. And the way we describe pediatric feeding disorder is across 4 domains. So there's kind of like the framework of PFD versus the diagnosis of PFD. But the framework of PFD2 is if there is kind of medically something going on that may be manifesting as some behavior problems, that's one of the pieces of dysfunction. And then if there's a feeding skill problem, so it takes us, early childhood through like primary and elementary school to learn how to eat. And so if there is any disruption in that process, it takes us even longer to learn how to eat. And I think that's a really common myth that people think that, oh, eating just comes really naturally, but it is a muscle and it's something that is a practiced and built up skill. And so that's kind of the feeding skill side of PFD. And then there's the nutrition side of PFD, and that can look like either nutrition is off because we're only eating certain foods or we have certain preferences around foods, or just the implications of all of the different interactions of the other domains. And then the fourth domain, in which is one that I feel really passionately about, is the psychosocial domain. And that is not only how a child feels about their experience at meal times and maybe how stressful it is for them, but also looking at it holistically with the whole family. Because one thing that we know about feeding, and as moms, I think we know this too, is we're so involved in the process. For breastfeeding or bottle feeding at the start, it's us in that process too. And so in the psychosocial domain, not only do we look at how the child feels about food and meal times and what stress is coming out from there and what behaviors are coming out that are trying to communicate that something is wrong, but also how is that impacting the whole family environment, and how are meal times feeling for the whole family. And so if there is dysfunction in that psychosocial domain, something is wrong and we've got to get to the bottom of it.
Definitely.
And so,
oh, sorry. I
yeah.
interrupted you.
Oh, no. I mean, I just kind of took a dive into PFD, but Feeding Matters is here for families and we're here for professionals too. And we really try to change the system and raise awareness.
And you've done just that. And I think it's really helpful for families to be able to see themselves in these domains and how it's broken up, and what child could really resonate with one particular domain, or it can be spread across all 4 domains or 2 domains or 3 domains. And I see a lot of my clients. I mean, of course, I know the pillars of PFD, but as you're describing them, I'm like, yep, they're, kind of fall into each of these pillars for different reasons, especially for kids with really severe sensory sensitivities. On the autism spectrum, it's like we're seeing a lot of anxiety around food and like that psychosocial domain. And then we see a lot of sensory preferences, which really limits the amount of foods that they'll eat, like what food groups. And so we see in that nutrition domain. And then we also see kids who have a hard time chewing because of low muscle tone and that medical reason for, not being able to expand their diet. And so I think being able to dig deeper, which is what you're doing through these pillars, because it's so, I think, easy to just say, oh, they're just a picky eater. And unfortunately, and I know this is kind of the motto of PFD too, it's not
picky eating. Yeah.
Yes, that word helps describe what's happening, but it just barely scratches the surface. And I think really discredits what's going on behind the scenes, because these kiddos, they can't eat. They need the support. And when we just write it off as picky eating, we don't get to dig deeper into it. And so just personally, that's what I've really taken away from this diagnosis, because I remember in the early days of my private practice, I mean, the diagnosis wasn't around yet. And I was always having a really hard time when I was billing insurance. I was like, what is this? Like,
how do I talk about this?
I can't, it doesn't
have a name
under any of this, or like, so now I don't bill insurance, and I want to talk about this because it's something I don't know a ton about that we'll get to later in the episode. But now it's a billable diagnostic code, which makes a huge difference. And I wish I would have had that at the beginning of my career, because that's where all of my clients were falling under. So
that's so true. And it validates, I think, families' experience, because I think when they're trying to either make sure their child is gaining weight or they're trying to just get nourishment in for the sake of, having a mealtime, even in rigid preferences or even in any other scenario where mealtimes are challenging, I think a family wouldn't say that that's picky eating. I think they may be told that that's picky eating, by professionals around them or even by society, maybe, you know that it's so much more. And so I think you're right. It discredits it and it invalidates their experience to call it picky eating when we know it's a real thing. And that's exactly why we thought it was important to make this its own code. We brought the experts together and we said, we need to name this because it means a lot more when there is a name.
Mhm.
People take it more seriously. People weren't taking it very seriously. And so, in bringing the experts together, we built the diagnostic criteria, we built the framework, and then we said, yeah, let's advocate for a code. And doing that also really validated what we were seeing, which was that this needed a name. Because when you go through that process of trying to get a diagnostic code, you just have to prove why it needs to be a standalone code and why it can't use all of the slew of feeding related codes that existed before PFD. And we were able to prove pretty quickly that it does need its own code. And so that came about October 1st, 2021 was the first time that the PFD code could be used. And so you're right. Now, when you are billing insurance, you could say this child has pediatric feeding disorder. And since the codes come out, we've been able to see, are there areas where that's working? Are there areas where that's not working? I think what we've learned is we still have a lot of education, outreach, and awareness that we need to do with not only the general public, but also insurance companies to help them understand what might be happening. And that'll, improve that. But now we actually have a name for it, and you would be able to write it on a medical record. And I think that that's really important.
Definitely. And, the education too that comes with being a medical professional, the time that it takes for even just research to come out to be taught in schools. What is that? Like 10 to 20 years?
It's so
something
long. I
ridiculous.
didn't even realize until I got into this work a little bit further that what we're seeing come out in publication, like it's new research, is several years and iterations old. And so it's really challenging as a professional to stay on top of what's coming out. And I think that's the case for PFD too, it being still a new diagnosis. We're 3 years into it having an official code, but in research length or research years, like dog years, it's still very young.
Totally.
Um,
Yeah. That's why it's
yeah.
important, to have this kind of education around it because I wouldn't have known. As a dietitian, we barely scratch the surface with pediatrics. If you really want to go into pediatrics, you have to really look for it yourself, really go and get your additional certifications. And especially if we start going to autism and sensory sensitivities, and there's just no way that any of that is just going to be naturally covered. And so it was through my SOS feeding therapy training that I learned about you guys and was able to learn more through your organization and your virtual conferences. But anyway, it's so important. And just like you said, it is so helpful for parents, I think, having a term to put to their experience. And this happens often. There are a lot of feeding terms because, these experiences are so common. Like food jagging, for example, is a term that parents are explaining to me. I'm like, hey, there's actually a term for that. And they're like, wow, I feel so understood. Just
Yes.
having
Just
the
a name
name.
for it.
Yeah,
And knowing
exactly.
what's going on.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we think about at Feeding Matters the educational pathway for professionals a lot. And you being a dietitian and with your specialty in the autism community, how did you kind of identify that you needed more feeding support and how did you go about finding that? Because I think that's a real challenge for a lot of professionals. And I think that's why on the family side, it's really hard to find qualified providers.
Totally. I was working outpatient at a clinic for children with developmental disabilities, and I knew the importance of nutrition and what foods they need to be eating. And so I was so equipped with the why. This is why we need nutrition. And then 90% of families were like, well, we can't, there's no way we can
Yeah.
even try to introduce that. And it was like, so what suggestions do you have on expanding their diet? I'm like, repeated
Mm,
exposure. So
mm,
it was this thing where I was like, none of the recommendations for picky eating are fitting.
mm.
None of this is working. And
Yeah.
so thankfully it was an interdisciplinary clinic, and there were OTs and speech therapists who also provided feeding therapy. And they showed me that hierarchy on the SOS, like steps to eating. And I was like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. I have to go to this conference. Like I paid my own way. The clinic wouldn't pay for it. And I was like, I just have to go because this is just
Yeah.
going to change, I think, my life and so many of my like clients' lives.
Mm,
And just coming back from that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the answer, and then being able to find, okay, there are organizations like Feeding Matters that are advocating around this. And now that I'm thinking about it, it was either 2016 or 2017. I'm pretty sure it was 2017. And that's, I know when you all were doing a lot of advocacy work to try and get PFD into the diagnostic criteria.
Yeah, that was right in the middle of the advocacy work.
Yeah, and so it was almost validating for me because I was able to see, okay, there is so much more to it than this. And my brother's on the autism spectrum, so I knew he really struggled with it. But I mean, now he's 29, and at the time, he was in his early 20s. And so pediatric feeding disorder didn't necessarily fit anymore.
Yeah,
So it was
sure.
one of those things that totally changed how I operate in my practice and teach others. And so sometimes you just kind of have to learn by doing and learning from other practitioners.
Well, that's kind of what we find. There isn't an exact pathway to follow if you want to specialize in pediatric feeding. Different associations based on your discipline, whether you are a dietitian or a speech language pathologist or occupational therapist, or even a physician or psychologist, they have kind of a pathway to follow through their associations. But a lot of times, if you're an individual that wants to specialize in this, you've got to do what you did, which is find a course, and there's many out there that fits your needs, and take it, or take many courses and build your toolkit as a clinician, and then practice that work. And I think as we support families, that's a really hard thing to share with them, that you've really got to ask questions to your providers, understand how they've learned about feeding, and understand what coursework they've taken, and how do they partner with families in this work, and how do you as a family member feel comfortable in engaging with them in this way. Because something that's so different about feeding and feeding therapy in general is, for a lot of other kinds of therapy, you can take a break. You can, go on vacation for a week. But if you do that with feeding therapy, you may have a break from feeding therapy, but you're still having meal times 5 times a day, or, 3 times a day with snacks. So you're not really getting the break that you can with some other types of interventions for different conditions.
Definitely. Having that conversation, like you said, asking, where did you learn about feeding? What qualifications do you have? I was just talking with one of the members in my community a few days ago, and she was like, we've been in feeding therapy for 6 months, which also in the scheme of things, feeding does take a long time.
It does take a long time. That's another thing we've got to change our perspective on.
Totally. She was like, we have not seen one win. I was like, okay, let's start digging into this. What qualifications do they have? Because anyone could provide feeding therapy. However, to be able to really support somebody with pediatric feeding disorder or with severe sensory issues, we really need a very specific approach. Would you mind talking a little bit to that, how that would differ and why somebody with PFD might need more support or particular support from feeding therapy?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes to actually having knowledge and access to what pediatric feeding disorder is. Because so many times we've had families come to us and say, we've been trying feeding therapy, but it hasn't been working, and we need to find another therapist. And we do have a provider directory on our website that has many different therapists. And I think the ones on there at least understand PFD. But when something isn't working, you got to kind of go back to square one and look at it from the framework perspective of, okay, do we really know where maybe pain is coming from and why we might be trying to avoid meal times? Do we really have a good understanding of if there's allergies present or if there's GI problems present? Because I think you got to get a hold of that medical side and that medical domain of the framework first, because anything going on in that area is probably impacting what behavior is being communicated. It's probably impacting their feeding skill and their nutrition in other ways. And so if we're progressing down a path of trying to do some feeding therapy and practicing exposure or practicing chewing and all of the different ways that feeding therapy exists, if we're not looking at it holistically, we might be having bad exposure after bad exposure after bad exposure. And I think one thing I've spent a lot of time reflecting on, especially recently, is how we need to identify this early. And if we're not identifying it early, we've seen so many families go from provider to provider to provider trying to find answers. And unfortunately, that's just time lost. and honestly more trauma. And that trauma builds over time. And then you become a child and an adult with a really bad experience with food. And so that's something that I think would like to impact more. And it starts with the qualified providers. And for anyone out there who is trying to figure out if they've got the right provider or trying to look at what, feeding therapy they need to go do, we have a list of questions on our website that might be helpful to ask a provider about their experience, about PFD, just to kind of better know. You've got to have a good fit if you're going to proceed down this path with someone.
I would love to put that link in our show notes, and I would love to use that as well because I haven't seen that list, and
For sure.
that would be fantastic. And then other resources I'm going to put in the show notes would be the Feeding Matters provider directory. And then
Yes.
you also have a questionnaire as well. Would you mind sharing what that is and who would utilize that questionnaire?
Yeah, our questionnaire is a very helpful resource because if you're a family member or even a provider, really, that has a patient, but if you're a family member that is worried about feeding, it gives you the language to describe what's happening, but it also, you're not crazy, like something is wrong. And so there's two different versions. There's a long form infant and child feeding questionnaire version on our website that asks like 12 to 15 questions, and it's based on what age your child is. And so you go through that and you answer the questions, and it kind of shows you maybe what's typical for meal times at that age. And then at the end of the questionnaire, it spits out red flags that may be an indication that we need to look further at what might be happening around feeding. If you don't have that time and you just want to go to our family roadmap, we have 6 questions that have been shown to have a high sensitivity and specificity for identifying pediatric feeding disorder. And a lot of those are like, do you think something's wrong? Or, how long do meal times take? If they're too short or too long, that's a big indicator. And so those 6 questions, if you screen positive for 2 or more of those, then that means we need to look a little bit further as well. So that questionnaire is a huge help for families to really identify what might be going on. And other times we've heard from families that they've tried to talk to their pediatrician about it and that they might not be heard. And so I think if you're a family who has tried to do that, I also like the questionnaire because it gives you the language to be able to say, here's what I'm seeing, and this is what this organization is sharing, and we have research that backs some of this stuff up. And so then you are able to have a good conversation with your provider about it, because I think sometimes they're just in such a rush that they're not really hearing. They may just be hearing, oh, it's picky eating and we just need to wait it out, or we just need a few more exposures. But if they see on a paper that meal times are taking a really long time, or that there is coughing and choking at the table, then we need to be looking a little bit deeper. And so I think in that sense, it can really help a conversation happen too.
Definitely. And, practitioners are data-driven people. And so having something on a piece of paper where it's like, we've done this questionnaire, here is this research, here is this information and qualifications. And I think it helps us speak their language sometimes. And unfortunately, we have to come to the table speaking their language if they don't have the language already to be able to identify pediatric feeding disorder. And so I tell my clients that a lot of time we have to bring it to the table, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but we do. Even I, as a parent, I now have 2 children, and a half-year-old had feeding like struggles very early on, kind of like the acute PFD side. And I realized we do need our pediatricians to know about this, but they don't yet. And it's still so new. And so we have to be able to advocate in a way that speaks their language. I think that's a great way to share that.
I did want to ask your personal experience. It sounds like, I don't know how old your child is who struggled with the acute pediatric feeding.
Yeah, so he's a year and a half. So it was interesting because I was at Feeding Matters before I had kids and before I knew about feeding. And so I had my first son, he's almost 5. And he really taught me that as parents, we don't get told a lot about feeding. And so I think in that sense, I had done all of this work in this world of pediatric feeding disorder. And then I realized, well, people aren't going to be able to identify pediatric feeding disorder if we don't even know what feeding development looks like in a child. Like, we don't know. We pay attention to what it looks like on a box if they're crawling or they're walking, or we pay attention to social media or kind of like those papers that our pediatricians give us, but we just don't know. And so that really got me thinking about how we can raise awareness of PFD in a different way, we need to be speaking to all parents to be aware that feeding development, it happens over time. It doesn't happen automatically. And so at any point in that development, something could go wrong, and then we need to build back those skills or go back to the PFD framework. And so he kind of taught me that. And then George, my 1.5-year-old, he had a cow's milk protein allergy early on, and then a lot of like anatomical stuff, which was preventing him from latching. And so it took us a while to identify that. And I think me having all of this knowledge, I expected a little bit more of myself. And I've since learned a little bit more about you can't do that in that space. That's why we need our pediatricians to know. But luckily, we were able to identify his issues. And I think for me, knowing what I know and being in this organization for so long, I knew I had resources. And that's what we hope to provide for our families is we're here for you to walk this road with you. It can feel really lonely. And so we're here with you and you have hope because of us. We have resources for you. And, that part, I want to make sure families know that we're here for them.
Definitely. And I mean, to your point, we talk about feeding at 6 months with your pediatrician. Okay,
Yeah.
starting solids.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know that my pediatrician has really revisited. Like maybe he's been like, how's he eating? Like he's doing okay. He's doing fine. But I think that's really all he asks. If I didn't know what I know, I mean, my son is 21 months old and he's definitely going through a stage where he's very particular about what he's
Yeah.
eating. But I also know the signs of pediatric feeding disorder. And I'm like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
from what I can understand, we're just having some preferences around food. We don't have red flags for PFD, but my pediatrician also isn't asking. And so I think if I didn't know these things, I think it would be really helpful for somebody to go through like a screener. I wish there were a screener
Yeah.
that
I
we could,
hope that screener gets into well child visits because I
yes,
think we've talked to pediatricians who have told us all we talk about is feeding. We talk about feeding all the time, but from the family's experience that, yeah, it may be a question, but it's not a real conversation and there's not a lot of answers. I do think there's a lot of value in being able to parent knowing about PFD because I think that was really helpful in George's experience. I think that's what made him only have acute PFD and not switch to chronic PFD because, I was able to constantly be thinking about the PFD framework. And so we got to the GI, we kept his relationship with food really good. And so we were still working through some of his stuff, but he doesn't show a lot of the signs of PFD because I think we've been trying to stay on top of it. Yeah. So if you were able to screen every single well visit that you went to, I know it would make
can you
such a difference.
imagine? Like even if it was like a 6 month, 12 month, 18 month,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
just
Those critical points.
oh, like that would be so huge. And I think parents would be able to catch it early on and recognize what is happening and feel understood. And oh man, that would be fantastic. Well, could
Hopefully
you
they can.
share where both practitioners could get resources on how to get more information about PFD so that they can help so many more people, and then where parents could also go to get these resources to help advocate for themselves as well?
Yes, definitely. So on the provider side, on provider and family side, I encourage everybody to go and follow us on social media at Feeding Matters. Our website is feedingmatters.org. On our website, we have lots of different materials, both for professionals and for providers. I think signing up for our newsletter is a really easy way to keep it top of mind for everybody. On the provider side, we have a lot of different webinars and videos on our website. And we also have a conference. We actually have a feeding and eating psychology summit coming up that really dives into the psychosocial domain a little bit further, both for pediatric feeding disorder and for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which the two cross over a lot. And then I think what's also really beneficial about being a provider in the Feeding Matters community is you do have a community of other providers. And so I think, you and I were talking before this, you kind of have to build a community because we all don't have answers and we're trying to find them together. And hopefully Feeding Matters can be a leader in that. But coming to us and finding others like yourself is a really valuable thing. And being able to network within Feeding Matters community is helpful. And the same goes for families too. We offer families that same network of other families who have walked this journey either alongside you or before for you to lean on. And so for families, I think the easiest place to go besides the social media is on our website. There is a family map that kind of asks those 6 questions, and then it leads you to our family guide, which is a 101 on PFD, talks about the different tests and questions to ask and some of those things. But then if you are struggling, we can connect you with another parent who has been there, and a parent who can spend some time on the phone with you or on Zoom with you, walking through with you. And sometimes that's just preparing for an appointment. How am I going to be empowered enough to speak my mind during this appointment when I'm intimidated going into it? And so that program is called Power of Two. And I really encourage any family who wants to talk to another family to reach out to us, because we can connect you with someone.
I learned about that program at your most recent virtual conference back. Was it April?
Yeah, April.
Okay. And I remember thinking, oh man, like how many of my clients would just feel understood just to be able to talk to somebody else about, what they're experiencing. I think being able to talk with another parent who's been there and gone through it is so important. And one thing I also loved about that conference too is that I came as a practitioner, of course, but I was really impressed because on your panels, there was always a parent advocate or somebody who has been through the experience. So you had a panel of practitioners, but then there was also the family perspective from it. And I thought that brought a lot of really important perspective, because I think as practitioners, it's easy for us to forget that that's such an important piece of the team.
It's a key piece of the team. We talk about multidisciplinary care, interdisciplinary care, and we think about the different disciplines, the different domains, our scope of practice and everything, but you're missing a key piece if you're not respecting and valuing a family member in the same way that you are a physician that you're talking to or another discipline that you're talking to, because they know more about their child, they have the history. So yeah, I'm glad that you felt that come through the conference. That's something that's really important to us. Family-centered care is not just a word that we use. It's something that we live and breathe. And it's a key piece to our values and our philosophy. And we really are passionate that families get to speak on their experience. They are experts in their experience. And I'm glad that that came through.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved it. And then you have another conference. Is it in January, February?
So so this will be the first time that we're in person again since 2019, and we will always be virtual. It's important for us to be digital first to make sure that we reach those that can't come to things, either for childcare reasons or travel or geography reasons. But we have an in-person conference February, like end of February, and it'll be in Phoenix, which is a beautiful time to come to Phoenix if anybody wants to come.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. And you shared some great resources. I'll be sure to link them all in the show notes below. But thank you so much for being here and for sharing all of this information.
Yeah, Brittyn, thank you so much for having me. Your passion for just children in general and kids with autism and PFD, it's just amazing. And I'm just grateful to be able to know you and have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So everyone who's wanting to learn more about PFD, you can check out the show notes, follow Feeding Matters on Instagram as well, and just check out all of those amazing resources that can really help you get the care that your kiddo deserves. So, and practitioners too, like please look into this, because we
know about
we're
PFD,
the leaders. We are the leaders who need to be helping families identify this and give them the guidance to walk through and not feel so alone.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Jaclyn. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining me for another episode of Nourishing Autism. If you enjoyed this podcast, I'd love to invite you to join us inside of the Nourishing Autism Collective, an empowering and supportive community for moms of kids on the autism spectrum to get nutrition and picky eating support from me and my team of autism dietitians, access my autism nutrition library, explore hundreds of kid-friendly recipes, connect with other moms on a similar journey, and learn from top autism experts like occupational therapists, speech therapists, and more. Come join us at nourishingautism.co. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, I'd be so grateful if you shared it with a friend and gave it a 5-star review on Apple and Spotify podcasts so I can spread the word about nutrition for autism and reach more amazing families like you. See you next time.